And welcome from the floor of the 2017 AFP Conference. Glad to have Mike and Dave here. Maybe we start off with a quick introduction of what your role is at Bottomline.
Sure. My name is Mike Vigue. I am head VP of Product Solutions for our Global Business Solutions, which covers North American business payments market for corporate customers.
My name is Dave Allen. I'm Vice President of our Cyber Fraud and Risk Management Solutions with our banking division.
Excellent. So we have, just to set the stage for the customer security program, we have, what, about 50 business days until self-attestation deadline, is that right?
Yes.
So
January 1st.
January 1st, you have to have it, you be self-attested to that program. So maybe you could begin with a short description on what is the customer security program and what gave rise to it. What are the triggering events and is this helpful?
Sure, I can take that one. The SWIFT customer security program was a result of just some breaches that occurred, not necessarily within the SWIFT network last year, but within across a couple of banks where some transactions where the SWIFT network was used in order to commit some fraudulent transactions, rather sizable ones, in excess of $80 million out of some banks in Southeast Asia. So as a result of that, SWIFT took a very, very hard look at how they can help their customers protect themselves from such fraud and make sure that it didn't happen again in the future. So what they did was they put out guidelines for 27 different protocols, of which approximately 50% of those are mandatory, and allowed customers to really take a look at what those protocols and suggestions were so that they could help lock down their SWIFT infrastructures. Not just the software itself, but the processes and the technology surrounding their gateway onto the SWIFT network. And as a result of that, the customers are expected to self-attest that by the end of this year, they have tested and implemented those protocols, so in order to protect themselves. The thought being that if one organization is not protected, then nobody's really protected, because in essence, these you can only control and really have the ability to sort of manage and look for fraud around what you know. So it's important that each and every organization that connects to SWIFT implement and follow the guidelines.
So is this attestation to the entire world or to a subset to other counterparties, or how would you describe that?
They're attesting to SWIFT themselves that they have implemented the required protocol and then even at least considered some of the optional protocols. So they're attesting to SWIFT that they have in essence done so, in which case it allows the organizations that may be doing business with banks or other organizations leveraging SWIFT, that they feel comfortable that those organizations have followed the guidelines in place. So, for example, if I was doing business with an organization that did not attest, I may consider changing my relationship to somebody else.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's an important final point, which is obviously the environment. And again, it's important to note that the SWIFT network is secure and it has not been breached. It's really been the corporates and the financial institutions that some, unfortunately, have been breached in terms of the infrastructure that is allowing access or gaining access to the SWIFT network itself. But to Mike's point, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And so if you have certain organizations that have not secured their environment, which is one tenet of the SWIFT CSP, if they haven't determined who has access and limiting access to that environment, and also providing understanding and monitoring of both the transactions and the behavior associated with that access. If they're not doing those things associated with the CSP, then SWIFT reserves the right, and they've stated this publicly, that they could publish, if you will, to the other FIs or corporates that this organization has not done the proper mandates associated with the CSP.
That's excellent. So they reserve the right to put that out, which is an excellent concept. It can also be, it's sitting on the KYC or Know Your Customer platform, so you can self-expose yourself to others. You can open it up to what your attestation is to your trading partners, which is a great method of being, not opening up to the world, but to those that you trade with, which is excellent. You had mentioned earlier about mandatory and advisory. Is advisory optional? Does that mean optional?
It does mean optional at this point. I would put it in slightly different terms. Strongly advised.
A leading practice, something you should...
Best practice.
Something you should do. It's just not mandatory yet. And some of those are scheduled to become mandatory in the short term, so certainly something to look at, whether you attest to them or not. It should be looked at to see if that's an area for improvement. Excellent. You had brought up the point about you should be looking at the transactions and the behavior. Can you unpack that for someone who may not be aware of this behavioral analysis that is so important to detecting fraud or anomalous activity?
Sure. So this is, I'll try to be as concise as possible, but there's a lot of very good solutions out there associated with fraud monitoring and preventing security breaches, but a lot of these tools depend on behavioral analytics, machine learning, if you will. But machine learning is associated with having enough data associated with either the sender or the recipient of the transaction that you can determine what's anomalous. What's different about SWIFT messages and the transactions is that you may be a correspondent bank that sits in the middle, that there isn't enough history there. And so when you talk about behavioral analytics and transactional monitoring, the best practice associated with preventing any type of additional breaches is a combination of analytics or machine learning, as well as, if you will, rules or hard-coded known ways that fraudsters are breaching the infrastructure associated with gaining access to the SWIFT network.
Yeah, it's also important to look at, you want to look as far and wide as you can around a transaction. So just looking at the transaction itself is not enough. Fraudsters are, they are aware of the fact that people are looking at transactions. So you've got to be looking at access to solutions and determining if the behavior of the user interacting with that software is different than what the typical behavior is of people in that role or that user himself. In the case of the breach from last year, for example, there was malware detection that was disabled on the machine. Audit logs were erased, et cetera. So it's not just about looking at the transaction itself, it's looking around and as far and wide as you can about that transaction and the user doing it, so that you could actually develop the best profile to be able to have the best chance of stopping fraud before it leaves your organization.
Right, I guess an example of that is if I'm a criminal, I go and I gain access to something, the first thing I'm going to do is try to set up a transfer to an account I control. It's going to be a non-repetitive, non-structured, so if I have to reset some ID, I gain control, then I do it. Detecting that type of behavior is like, hey, a reset, a new non-repetitive transfer, that's going to require more scrutiny.
Absolutely. And I think what matters most in terms of talking about protection is that a number of organizations are leveraging existing solutions that they may have applied to different payment types or different channels. But if you look at the legacy of some of those solutions that are out there, they're maybe more associated with wire, maybe associated with card or credit or checks. Trying to extend that capability to something that is somewhat unique around the SWIFT messages and the secure network. It's not a best practice, so you really have to look at and choose a solution that is going to be able to truly identify the anomalous activity that's not just based on legacy or antiquated methods.
When people are required this, who's required to self-attest? Okay, so if I'm a company and I use SWIFT, but I use a service bureau, like your service bureau, aren't I protected? Isn't that the feature? I don't need to self-attest, or is that false?
That is false. You are responsible. You need to be working with your bureau to make sure and understand what it is they're doing to attest for you. And the best and the good ones out there are actually embracing this, working with their customers and explaining to them what it is they need to do and how the bureau themselves is going to be facilitating that. Because a lot of these things are process-based. So if your bureau is handling and doing and responsible for some of those processes, you need to make sure that your bureau is is going to have implemented the things that SWIFT is saying that need to be implemented.
Excellent. So they take off some of the work. You have the lower scope if you're using a bureau versus you have all the SWIFT hardware in-house.
Absolutely, and in fact, the bureaus, like ourselves, for example, are actually going above and beyond and looking at, just because SWIFT says that these are the guidelines that they want you to follow, doesn't mean you can't be doing more. So we're looking at, which is why we've actually deployed some of the things that Dave was just talking about as far as the behavioral analytics software.
So if we're looking at 50 days away to complete the attestation, there's a lot of questions. I mean, there's probably hundreds of questions depending on your architecture. There's a lot of work, and some people may take this attitude of let's tick the boxes as quick as we can and be done with it. How is that a harmful view to what the intent is and to the organization? Is that a harmful view, and how so?
Yeah, I'll take that. So very simply, think about it in two terms. There's compliance with the CSP, so that you're not put on the naughty list, but there's preventing potential fraud, and both are important. I would argue preventing fraud is the most critical aspect of making sure that the organization is protected. So just taking the most minimal stance, if you will, of self-attestation and the CSP and compliance, or with the 27 controls that Mike mentioned, that's the minimum step that needs to be done. But making sure that, again, you're securing the environment and the architecture associated with gaining access to the SWIFT environment, making sure that you limit access to who has access to that architecture, and preventing any type of hijack credentials. And then finally, making sure that you have progressive solutions in place that you can detect anomalous behavior. That's what's most important. So CSP and making sure that you self-attest by the end of this calendar year, important. More important that you have those other solutions and tools in place, such as what we offer with our service bureau.
Yeah, my opinion in that is it's almost, it's like the bear analogy, right? You don't have to be faster than the bear, but you have to be faster than the other guy who's also running from the bear. When I look at it, I don't want to be last in that line if I was any type of organization out there. I think today's cyber fraud and payment fraud, the criminals are very sophisticated. They know which banks are doing what, which organizations are doing what, and they're targeting the weakest links. So if all you want to do is check the boxes, then you're setting yourself up to be potentially one of those weakest links.
Yeah, we may need to upgrade that bear analogy, maybe a cyber bear that's automated. I mean, they're targeting multiple companies. It's not just one bear; it's multiple bears targeting anybody who's weak in these particular areas, including. Less than a week ago, there was another bank that had lost over 60 million. 60 million have been sent out. Fortunately, they've been able to recover over 59 million, but still, that level of exposure, the attacks are high. So we're close to the time frame for when you have to attest. What should people be doing now if they haven't completed their attestation? What are the top things they need to do?
Well, I mean, if you're a bureau customer, you should be on the phone daily with your bureau and finding out what it is they're doing and helping you through it. It's just 50 days, but I'll tell you, if you're not that educated as to what this means, definitely get educated. There are organizations out there, a lot of them here today, that are talking about it. And if you're still concerned or confused or have questions, then I think you should get on the phone with your SWIFT representative and see what they could do to help you.
I think my final thought is when we engage with our clients and prospects, most organizations are very well educated on the CSP itself, and so to answer your question, Craig, I think it's important that that these organizations rely on trusted partners, consultants, if you will, just to make sure that you can, with such a shortened amount of time left, that you can make sure that you get through that process, because there is so much information out there. So it's a delicate situation, but one that hopefully most organizations have already complied with.
Yeah, excellent. I know we find companies that they haven't even looked at the 100-page or the 39-page document that help you understand it, and they're sort of like, well, I was hoping that would go away. And you need to form a team, quickly get online to see what's going on, and get help where needed. Like you said, those are perfect approaches to addressing this. And we see remediation. Maybe you need multi-factor authentication, maybe you need to adjust timeouts, secure training, and there might be some other elements where you don't have any kind of good logs or anomalous behavior detection. So there's usually a handful of areas that need remediation. Some of them are very quick, some will take a little bit more work, but you learn those as you go through the process. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts, but I did want to thank both of you for spending a little bit of time talking about SWIFT CSP and the background of why that's important and the deadline that's coming up, and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.